you cannot, the fact that you see there, that band there, doesn't, so could, I know, I am wondering if the reason why a lot of you propose that HSP70 is bound to radioactive proteins is because you're thinking that HSP70 is right there and is bound to radioactive proteins, so you're seeing other radioactive proteins right here bound to HSP70. If you're thinking that, you need to remember that, so if you're not thinking that, that's all good. The reason that's not correct is because you're boiling in SDS, which denatures all proteins. All binding is removed. Nothing binds to anything in SDS. So when you're running things on the gel, nobody is bound to anyone. All right? Is that clear? If they were bound to each other, then they would migrate out of their respective molecular weights, which it would be such a coincidence that happened to be also 70 kilodaltons. Is that clear, or did I make everybody more confused? Yes.
What letter is it?
So, correct answer is D. And E is false because of what I was just saying. Nobody remains bound to HSP70 with SDS, in the presence of SDS. That's it.
Was the wording just synthesized by the cell? Isn't it, you can only see it synthesized during the pulse? Or are you still in the pulse?
So it was just synthesized moments ago.
Oh, right.
During the pulse. Yes.
So even though some proteins co-precipitate, the SDS and boiling process separates those?
Correct. Yeah. So if it was bound to a 50 kilodalton protein, then you would see two bands, one at 70, which is HSP7, new HSP70, and one at 50. And in fact, that protein at HSP at 70, which was just made 15 minutes ago, probably itself is just in the process of getting folded too, right? It was just coming out of the ribosome, being bound by older HSP70s to help it fold, right? So, but we don't know that from this job, yeah.
So we know that HSP70 is radioactive, but you're saying it's not bound to proteins. What part of HSP70 is radioactive then? Is the antibodies or is it the...
Not the antibody.
Yeah.
The polypeptide of HSP70, the protein itself, HSP70 itself is radioactive.
Okay, but it's not bound to
Correct.
other proteins.
And that's why we see that band right there represents, is HSP70, radioactive HSP70.
Got it.
And there's also a lot of non-radioactive HSP70 right behind it that we cannot see because it's not radioactive. Super clear. More questions because it's going to get more complex. Back there.
Sorry, this is kind of asked, but so does the HSP70 become radioactive because it's bound to that other protein and then when they separate?
That's what I want to say. Definitely, that's a common misunderstanding, and that is not what's happening. Right. So it is bound to, if it binds to a radioactive protein, that radioactivity doesn't transfer to HSP70 ever. Right. It remains separate. Right. So the only reason why it is radioactive is because it happens to have been synthesized during the pulse. Yes?
So in this, we can assume that we isolated HSP70 by itself because there's no other radioactive protein in the bunch?
Oh, that's going to be the next question.
Okay.
All right. So the fact is that we can see HSP70 right there, and doesn't project very well, but there's a very nice clear band of HSP70 in the original right there also. All right. So that's just what I'm asking for now. Why do we see it there? Because we grabbed it, and it happens to have been made during the pulse radioactive. All right, so now let's move on to the next step. All right. So, here. let's just compare for now what happens, the experiment in lane 1 with lane 4. All right? So lane 1 is right here, is what happens when we pulse the cells, break them open right after the pulse, we grab HSP70, as we talked about, bowl with SDS, run it on the gel. That when we break the cells open, we don't provide them additional ATP. So any ATP that they contain inside is going to get diluted out when you break the cells open. So gone. And then we're going to compare with lane 4, which is doing the exact same experiment, but not in the wild type bacteria, but in the mutant bacteria that doesn't have this type of HSP70. Same conditions, same buffers, everything the same, wild type cells, mutant cells, all right? Which of these conclusions would be the correct one? So the favorite answers are A and D, all right, about equal amounts. So have a quick discussion and then vote again.
What again? I picked D everything in the cell. Oh, I see. They're not bound to HSP70 because HSP70 doesn't
All right, give me a vote again. Let's do this quick. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so we did the experiment by growing the cells, right? So we have the wild type cells here. We give them radioactivity, right? They make radioactive proteins. We reach with our antibodies. We grab HSP70, right? Put it on lane 1. Do we see HSP70 there? Yes, there was a band I pointed out. There's a band there at 70 kilodaltons. Do we see other proteins? Yeah, lots of other proteins, right? So that's what in lane 1. Lane 4, we have the mutant E. coli. Do we feed it radioactivity? Yeah, it's a pulse chase experiment, so we're feeding it radioactivity. can the cell make radioactive proteins?
Yes.
Yeah, it's growing, it's alive, so it's going to make radioactive proteins, right? We reach with our antibody against HSP70. Can we grab any HSP70? No, because there's no HSP70. So we come out empty-handed, all right? So that's what you're seeing there. Now, that's if things work properly. Now, what if my antibody or my beads or my technique are awful and I'm just making a mess of it? Say that I take not a nice clean antibody, but a sponge. When I go into my lysate of radioactive proteins with a sponge, what am I going to grab? A sample of everything, right? When I boil that in SDS and load it on the gel, what am I going to see? Everything that the cell has, from little proteins, middle proteins, large proteins, which is what I see in lane 1, right? Now let's go to the mutant one. If I have a sponge, what am I going to grab? Hmm?
Just the mutant, sure.
Is the mutant one, and I have a sponge, and I grab with the sponge, what am I going to grab? Nothing or everything?
Everything.
Everything, right? So if I'm working the experiment with a bad sponge, I should see the exact same thing in lane 1 and lane 4. Right? Which is, I'm just grabbing everything radioactive in the cell. Little, medium, and large. That's not what I see. I'm going with my antibody. And what this is telling me is that if I don't have HSP70 there, there's nothing to bind, and nothing comes through. So that's a beautiful control to tell me that my antibody is very good, my technique is very good, and when there shouldn't be anything in the gel, there's nothing in the gel. It's a clean gel. Right? So that tells me that the antibody is working specifically, all right? And that's why we have that result. So it's not A, because we said we did feed radioactivity to that mutant bacteria, so it should make radioactive proteins. Yes?
So since you said it's a very clean antibody, since it's very specific, so why is lane 1 still in
Like a mess.
Yeah.
So that's the super important question, yes. So why do we see proteins all up and down on the gel? What are those proteins?
Those are the proteins that are bound to HSP70. Because there's no ATP, it can't fold them, so they stay associated.
So that would be the next step, but just simply experimentally, that there are other bands that are coming along. We know the experiment is clean. So if proteins are coming along with a clean antibody, then we call that a co-immunoprecipitation, right? And that means that they are bound by HSP70 to HSP70. And the HSP70 is being grabbed by the antibody, and these proteins are going along for the ride. And there's proteins small, medium, and large that are being bound by HSP70. Yeah.
But so if the reactivity is only present in HSP70, wouldn't the co-immune participants, would they all be like invisible essentially in the gel?
They are visible because they happen to have been synthesized at that moment in the pulse. Right? Yeah. So they were just synthesized right there at the pulse. Yeah.
And so I don't remember what it was the other day, the exact wash you needed to use, but so if you didn't want to see the co-immunoprecipitants, you would have to wash it with something super strong, right? And in all cases, that's just not what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was another question back there. When does boiling with SDS occur? Boiling of SDS occurs after you have grabbed with your beads, cleaned the beads, now you boil with SDS and load it on the gel. Correct. So once you boil with SDS, you break the bond between the antibody and the antigen, and between the protein and the co-immunoprecipitated protein. Yeah.
Is that what you're saying the difference is between like lane 1 and 2 and 3 is that lane 1 has not been washed with SDS buffer, and that's why we see everything?
No, all of the lanes have been treated the exact same way. The wash and boil with SDS.
So it's about timing.